Welcome to another Patch Tuesday. This month, there's a lot of news kind of leading up to Patch Tuesday. There've been a lot of 0 days, a lot of threats going on, a few things that we're going to highlight there just so you've got that awareness if needed. And then we're going to get into this month's lineup of vulnerabilities that were resolved by each of the vendors. And then we'll get into what we call Between the Patch Tuesdays. That's where we recap a number of third-party updates and other vendor updates that came out in between Patch Tuesdays. So those of you who have been on this webinar series continuously, you know that a lot of activity happens between the Patch Tuesdays. And many of those things may be things that you need to be concerned about. Possible critical vulnerabilities, zero-day threats, actively exploited vulnerabilities, that sort of thing. So that is what we're going to cover throughout there. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. By the time we released our content yesterday, Chrome had not released yet, but they did release a little bit later in the afternoon with 2 CVEs. So we will be talking about the Chrome update as well, even though it's not captured in the infographic and other things there. But Todd was able to pull in some details about that, and we do have that information for you. Starting up with our news lineup, and this is where I'm going to go over to sharing my screen, and we're going to go through some of these articles and talk about some of the key pieces that you may want to read up on, or if it's something that's relevant to your environment, follow up on. If it's not relevant to you, then you don't have to worry about those. Again, this slide here has all of the URLs there. So as we're going through, go ahead and download that presentation and be able to get access to those links quickly and easily if you need to. All right, so let me zoom in a little bit here. The first one I thought was, I typically look around for what is the best overall overview of the lineup of updates that came out across the different writers that are out there. It's hit and miss sometimes. I would say that each month I find a different writer got the best overall coverage for that. So rather than give you 10 articles, I try to get the one that was the best overall capture of that. So this month, Krebs on security definitely had the best overall coverage. From what I had seen, it had most of the things captured there, talking about some of the Microsoft vulnerabilities, a little bit more detail into some of those, the higher CVSS score vulnerabilities this month from the Microsoft side. They had a few tidbits about some of those from security researchers across the industry. The other areas that I wanted to call out is the Google update. The link here talks about the 2 vulnerabilities that were fixed in Chrome, which did see some active exploitation. So that is one that you may want to take a look at and make sure you understand what's going on there, or at least make sure that your Google Chrome updates are included in your patch maintenance this month. So a good coverage there as far as letting you know where the real risks are. That was probably the biggest additional risks on the Chrome side. That was in the September 3rd Google Chrome release. So if you have not updated Chrome or made sure that Chrome got auto-updated since earlier this month, that's going to be one of your higher priorities there, is making sure that you get those Google updates in place, because there were some exploited vulnerabilities there. WhatsApp was another application that definitely had some active exploitation recently here. This is on the Apple side. So WhatsApp on Apple iOS devices especially was being targeted in specific attacks, but you could see that this was fixed in iOS, iPadOS, macOS. So all of your Apple OS devices do have a couple of CVEs here to update that were actively being exploited. And then Brian talks a little bit about a couple of notable places to get some additional information. So many of you have heard us talk about where are some of the watering holes that we typically go to understand what are the impacts and things going on here. Patchmanagement.org, one of the really good ones to look at, but Ask Woody is another, which actually the moderator of patchmanagement.org is also one of the primary contributors to Ask Woody. So there's a lot of really good subject matter expertise in the industry for updates across a variety of different platforms, not just Windows, but a heavy emphasis on the Windows side, of course. Our areas are good places to find good information. Like a good example of that is those of you who may have had SSD issues arising from the August 2025 patch. It actually turns out that it was not related to the patch, it was related to the firmware that released initially. If you apply the firmware updates to the official release, it resolves the issue. But this was captured both here. Somebody asked the question here and somebody responded to it. But I believe both patchmanagement.org and Ask Woody had some good articles covering that one. So good examples of where you can find some of those known issues and things that people run into. There's a couple of good sources out there for that. If you were having or are still having some of those SSD issues since the August release, the issue seems to come from a specific vendor. They had a pre-release version of the firmware that shipped in a number of different cases. If you get updated to the latest firmware and have the official firmware release, it will resolve the issue. So that pre-release firmware version was the issue with those. All right, so that has a couple of good links there. The Android flaws that occurred earlier, both Android and Apple OSs all had several vulnerabilities resolved here recently, a few with active exploitation. So this article just goes through the couple of CVEs that were actively being targeted there. And you want to make sure that you get your Android devices updated and make sure that you're plugging those actively exploited flaws there. One is an elevation of privilege in the Android kernel. The other is an elevation of privilege in the Android runtime. So a lot of elevation of privilege vulnerabilities this month being targeted. WinRAR, for those of you who do know you have WinRAR throughout your environment, there's been a 0-day being targeted there by Romcom, and there are now others exploiting that 0-day vulnerability. So make sure if you've got WinRAR in your environment, make sure that you're getting those CVEs resolved. So there's details about the CVE that was recently resolved there and information on which versions you should get up to make sure that you're plugging that vulnerability, which is actively being targeted by multiple threat actors now. Romcom was the first one. Since then, more have picked it up and are actively targeting it. So there's a couple of articles there about the WhatsApp exploits. Just again, details there if you need to read up on any of the additional information. But let's see. The next article, Hexstrike AI. This is going into we're all seeing an up-leveling in sophistication in IT because of the AI boom. So depending on, what AI technologies you've been consuming, we've seen benefits in generating content, in prompt-based interactions, in being able to get sentiment analysis and quick summarization of mass amounts of content. I've been using it pretty frequently to try to get an understanding of, when a whole bunch of new information comes out, like on Patch Tuesday. I'll do the generative AI approach to summarizing that, but then I will also follow up on that. So Todd and I were actually exchanging notes on this yesterday. I gave the Gemini breakdown of what had released yesterday, and then we compared it with everything that we were analyzing, and there was definitely a margin of error. I will not, beat around the bush about that. It is not a perfect model yet, but it was able to get me a few interesting tidbits that quickly got me to, here's a handful of things that I wanted to run down and validate which ones I wanted to keep and which ones were not relevant. A few of them were, whether you want to call them hallucinations or just it didn't have the updated information. There were a few gaps in what it was able to pull together within minutes of Patch Tuesday launching and that content becoming available. So it's pretty impressive what it can do. Well, that same type of technology in the hands of threat actors is doing some pretty impressive things as well. The fact that we can, use forms of agentic AI to be able to scale up and manage very specialized, AI models to handle very specific things and set up a kind of a command structure to optimize and execute specific campaigns definitely is improving. And you can see that in the article like this, where they're talking about threat actors being able to use AI orchestration to run over 100 specialized agents. So think of it this way. If I'm the threat actor, I set up my AI agent platform in that environment, and that's able to basically monitor, find out, oh, hey, I've got a system here. It's a Windows system with certain CVEs that I can exploit, and I can launch that attack using a chain of 3 CVEs. get that, and then I'm going to hand it over to the next AI agent who's going to basically embed itself into that system, set up my rootkit or some type of backdoor, and then go on to the next agent, which is specializing in lateral movement. All of that is the type of orchestration and scaling of specialized AI agents that they can manage now with this type of technology. So some pretty impressive things there, also very scary things, but it's definitely going to make an impact. We're already seeing a increase in the number of 0-day and 1-day exploits. 1-day exploits meaning the patch came out and very shortly after, within 24 to 48 hours, typically, you've already got active exploitation by a threat actor. This is one of those reasons why, if you haven't had this discussion, the drivers to move from on-prem to SaaS-based applications. One of the key drivers is the fact that a threat actor, if they get their hands on that on-prem code, which is not extremely difficult, they can decompile that and be able to start finding and exploiting vulnerabilities much more quickly. The time to resolve those for an on-prem solution is much longer. So one of your key factors in driving your initiatives to SaaS versus on-prem should definitely be security. This is some of those examples of why that's important. Our ability to respond to and close gaps is going to become more and more critical going forward. So this was a good read to really show how sophisticated the threat actors we're going to be faced with are able to scale up based on the technologies. So a good read there if you want to nerd out and understand more of the world. The next article here, I don't think I actually included the link in there, but it was another variation of AI being able to increase the sophistication of threat actors. Phishing attempts are getting more and more prevalent. In fact, there was another one I didn't include here. A researcher he's a notable security researcher even, was duped into a phishing scam, and that resulted in the threat actor gaining access to several distributions that they started to set up to try to mine crypto. So that's another one where there's a number of libraries that were flagged as a risk, and people are having to clean up and go make sure they don't have those vulnerable versions in there. That was another area where a sophisticated phishing attack was able to convince somebody who's trained to look for these things. If you catch people at the right time, if you set up the material just right, if you can correlate that with other real world events going on with that person, there is a point where even the best trained security professionals have a hard time spotting with 100% accuracy. So it is, again, the use of technology is making these types of attacks more sophisticated. This was just another good example of where we need to change our thinking to more of that zero trust mentality. Assume that anything and everything is potentially already compromised, and how do we mitigate risk or continue to try to identify and remove risks from our environment? So the exposure management shift, there's one of the docs we've got available in there today is around reshaping your vulnerability management strategy to more of an exposure management mindset. So that is a good piece of content there if you want to take a look at more of that. Apple did have a pair of 0-day vulnerabilities in their release earlier, or late August, actually. So this is just, again, catching up on that between the Patch Tuesdays. So Todd's going to touch on the Apple releases that happened in between as well. This would relate to several of those updates that came out, but it goes through and talks about the CVEs that were actively being targeted on the Apple side. Those of you running Citrix, NetScaler, ADC, and Gateway, there was an active attack going on there. So just be aware of that one. You most likely are already, but that was an article that came out just at the end of August as well. So most of you who are running NetScaler probably are already aware of that and responding to those. If you're not already responding, take a look at that and make sure that you've got the right information and you're validating that you've resolved the issue. And one of the more recent ones here, this one came out earlier this month as well. Drift was targeted in an attack here as well, and they were able to get in and steal a variety of information, gaining access to several companies' Salesforce data, but also there's a list of vendors that may have additional steps that you need to take. Cloudflare, for instance, Cloudflare was one of the companies affected by this. but the threat actors were also able to steal OAuth tokens and things like that as well. So if you look at any of these vendors in here are ones that have identified that they were hit as part of that attack and have provided additional guidance in many of those cases or information about that. Cloudflare, as an example, this article is one that Cloudflare put out. They've been doing a very good job of describing what happened during the breach, what they've been doing from a response perspective, and a timeline of updates, including when you get down to the point where they finally had some guidance of, hey, here's what all of our customers need to do. Any organizations using Cloudflare, you should be making sure that you had disconnected SalesLoft and its applications until everything was cleaned up there. Monday this week, apparently they had given the go-ahead that drift was resolved, and they were recommending customers can start to turn that back on if you're using like the Drift AI bot on your website. Rotating credentials, implementing frequent credential rotation, some good best practices around that, not just relating to this incident. Anybody who had issues should have changed out all their Cloudflare credentials as part of this, but also implementing a credential rotation for technologies like this, where you're switching out your API keys and other secrets used for any of these types of integrations more frequently. And then a variety of things around forensics, least privilege, other guidance there that they're providing to say, here's what you should be doing from a security best practice, regardless of the incident. That first action was kind of the immediate action. This is what you need to be doing. You need to rotate all your current credentials, but here's what you should be doing, going forward to ensure that you're more resilient to any type of impacts like this in the future. So a good article there, but if you do have any of these vendors in there, you may want to take a look at those and just see if there's additional guidance there that they've given for any of their technologies that might have been impacted from that token perspective as well. And I think that wraps up the news there. So we're going to go through the next couple of slides are the content released on Patch Tuesday and how you may need to take a look at any of that. The first one was kind of the oddball of the 81 CVEs resolved by Microsoft yesterday. This one was actually a third-party CNA. VulnCheck was the originator of this vulnerability. There wasn't a severity. There's no CVSS score on this one. So it's more of a information about this particular vulnerability. It's in Microsoft terms, it was the NewtonSoft.json is the module, but SQL Server is the application on the Microsoft side you need to update for that. You'll notice that the CVE actually is from 2024, but Microsoft is resolving it in SQL Server for the first time here. This is not a re-release. This is just Microsoft resolving it in SQL Server now. So information about the vulnerability versions. Down below here, you could see that the SQL 2016, 17, and 19 editions were affected. So depending on what service pack or CU level, or if you're on the GDR release branch, you could see the updates applying to each of those. So that's one of the two that was publicly disclosed this month. The disclosure did not include any code samples from what we can see here, but again, depending on what all changed in there, a threat actor may be able to reverse engineer a specific JSON module much more easily than looking at an entire application. So I wouldn't say this is a go rush out and patch this immediately, but it's have your SQL admins start rolling out the latest updates, test them adequately, and get them rolled out within your regular maintenance this month. So that was the first of the two public disclosures. The second one is a vulnerability in Windows SMB, another elevation of privilege vulnerability. There was a high number of elevation of privilege this month. 8.8 CVSS score, rated important. Again, kind of the key things we look for when you're looking at a publicly disclosed vulnerability is, was there any code exposed during that public disclosure? In this case, there was no publicly available exploit code available. There was no proof of concept code made available as part of that public disclosure, but enough information about the vulnerability and where it might reside was released in that to warrant Microsoft calling it a public disclosure. So in this case, again, this one's part of the Windows OS. The Windows OS did have some critical CVEs this month, but nothing so far out of the ordinary that it would warrant deploying the OS update immediately. So just make sure you've got your regular maintenance going here. Back to the topic of exposure management. It's changing your mindset to try to break out of the linear process of doing things. If you're doing the vulnerability assessment, prioritizing, making decisions, and then telling IT what needs to get done, you're spending a lot of time in the early part of that process. Exposure management is trying to break that model and decide on risk appetites first. We actually have a new couple of, it's like a 5-6 minute piece of content that we're going to be releasing here soon that I did, where I'm talking about that mindset of shifting to defining risk appetites, configure for those to be automated as much as possible. That way, when something new comes in, a new finding comes in, you don't have to disposition everything. Many of you are faced with the, hey, yeah, Microsoft just released a whole bunch of stuff. There's some new Google, Apple, all these other vulnerabilities that were now identified and fixed. Dispositioning every single one of those is an impossible task. Trying to monitor and resolve all of those is an impossible task. We need to get to a point where we've pre-decided what the risk level is that we want to tolerate and how frequently we want to update certain things. So those of you using the Ivanti Neurons for patch management experience, the patch configuration allows you to do routine maintenance, priority updates, zero-day response. A new thing that we're going to be adding this next in a few quarters here is going to be called continuous compliance. So think of each of those as a way to, once you've defined your risk appetite, configure for automatically taking care of things that fit into that model. If I want to update the browsers more frequently, those of you who were on the June Patch Tuesday, you saw me recap between May and June, there were 2 0 days. There were multiple public disclosures. There was 5 weeks of back-to-back security updates for all 3 major browsers that you definitely wanted to put in place as soon as possible. If I take that and I say, hey, I want to update browsers more frequently, I can put that into that priority updates task. I can do that task more frequently, and I can slim it down to say only very specific things are going to happen in that task, but it makes it so that I can automate resolution for those risk appetites that I've defined. Zero-day response, another task that we've got in there that makes it so that I'm already ready to go. I know exactly what's going to happen if I decide I need to resolve a 0-day quicker than my normal maintenance. I can put it into that bucket. Once it's approved, it's going to execute. If I chose to do a daily task or a twice-a-week task, whatever the case may be, once I add that in there, it's now approved and it's going to automate resolution. This is what the shift from traditional vulnerability management to exposure management is really entailing. It's predefining what we want, being able to disposition things only as needed. If it fits into what we've already defined, automation is going to take care of it. It only matters, we only have to disposition things if it bubbles up. That continuous compliance test that I talked about, this is in those environments where you are more highly regulated, where you do have a security drift tolerance level that you'll tolerate. And if it goes outside of those boundaries, you want to execute a task to get that machine up to date. So if any number of things can happen that can make a machine miss its maintenance window. Somebody was on vacation or out on leave, or they got a new machine 2 days after this month's maintenance completed, but that didn't get updated because it was in transit during this month's maintenance. All of those things, a new application being installed but on an old version, each of those could expose us to a vulnerability that is actively being exploited. If we want to take more proactive action, we can set these configurations up and be more proactive about it. That's that exposure management mindset. So different things like this, you're not going to decide, yesterday you didn't sit down and decide whether you were going to push the Windows OS update or not. You already knew you were going to. Really, you needed to know, is there anything in there that's going to make me have to deploy this quicker than my current maintenance plan is set to do? So that's kind of more of the mindset shift there. In this case, the public disclosures that we've got, neither of these are severe enough to warrant going into zero-day response mode. Based on what the information provided is, no active exploitation, no proof of concept code or anything available. So this Windows OS update, even though it's publicly disclosed, doesn't push that up over the threshold to say go into zero-day response mode. So that's kind of how we look at this if we're putting on that exposure management mindset and evaluating each of these updates there. So that wraps up the 2 public disclosures from Microsoft this month. Ivanti did have a couple of updates this month as well. We started this process nearly a year ago here of getting into a continuous Patch Tuesday cycle as well. So for Ivanti products, if we have security updates coming, we will go out of band if there's something more urgent, but typically we're resolving them on Patch Tuesday. We release those. Here's the 2 updates that released yesterday: the Ivanti Endpoint Manager and Ivanti Connect Secure, Policy Secure, and ZTA Gateways. So those are the 2 products that had updates. You can take a look at the advisories that released for each of these. If you are not already, you can actually go out to our blog and you can subscribe to the security advisory page and basically get an RSS feed notification whenever we release a new bulletin. Again, typically they're going to come out on Patch Tuesday and inform you of which of our products have security updates available. But if there is an out of band, I'm trying to think here, earlier this year in May, we did a May security update, but we also had a separate security advisory that released on the same day addressing a more specific issue that we wanted to call out more directly. So typically you're going to see these be monthly, but you may see additional ones as well. But that advisory RSS can get you basically notifications of when those updates come out. All right, getting into our Linux lineup. This month, we got a couple here that definitely might be requiring a little bit of investigation to see if you're exposed or not. The first one here is CVE 2025-8067. It's a vulnerability that's been fixed in UDisk 2. The specific versions are there capturing that. This one does have active exploits on this, and then they talk a little bit about who's being targeted. So if you're running RHEL-based distributions or derivatives like CentOS Stream, Alma Linux, or Rocky Linux, you should assume you're affected until proven otherwise. So they are trying to be very broad with this one. So this one does warrant a little bit of investigation to make sure that assume you are exposed unless you confirm specifically that you are not. But definitely take action on this one. There have been active exploits targeting this update. The second one is 2023-32256. You've heard us talk about the Linux world. It moves differently than the Windows and Mac side. It's an open source ecosystem. There's oftentimes vulnerabilities that are initially discovered and may be very slow to roll out over time. So it's not uncommon to see a vulnerability that's maybe 2 years old bubble back up and become kind of hey, this is one that you probably want to just double check and make sure that you're resolved against once the market catches up and makes sure that all versions are available and up to date. So in this case, this vulnerability could allow a remote attacker to disclose sensitive information affected by that Linux kernel install. Authentication is not required to exploit this. Only systems with KSMBD are enabled are vulnerable. So that's kind of the key piece on this one is on your Linux distributions, you can take a look and see, is that KSM service enabled? And if it is, then you want to make sure you get updated. If it's disabled, then you've mitigated the issue, but definitely one you want to take a look at and just see if you're exposed to this flaw. And the last of the CVE vulnerabilities this month is in Python, CVE 2025-58367. This one is a vulnerability. So the way they describe it is the Delta class is vulnerable to class pollution via its constructor. And when combined with a gadget available in Delta diff itself, it can lead to a denial of service and remote code execution vulnerability. So there's a couple of key pieces involved in there to be able to exploit this. But there's details available out there on how somebody might go about doing a type of approach to trying to do this class pollution. So I didn't see anything talking about this actively being exploited, but it looks like there's enough concept material out there that somebody could get to exploiting this if they put in the effort. Now, the who is affected, in this case, only applications that pass untrusted user input directly into Delta are affected. So this is one where you'd probably have to have somebody do a little bit of deeper investigation who knows that level of detail on Linux and Python coding to be able to determine if you're exposed to this. So that one may require some investigation to determine how exposed you are. More likely, it's probably better just to make sure that you've been patched up to that version 8.6.1 to ensure that your Python edition is resolving this vulnerability. Okay, that wraps up our news and recent vulnerabilities that we're talking about. Where Windows 10 end of life is knocking on our door. We are coming up on the October release very shortly here. So just make sure that you've got an idea of how many Windows 10 editions you've got left. Make sure that they're up to the latest branch release of Windows 10, because that's the one. If you're going to be doing continued ESU support, you have to be on the latest branch to be able to do that. And ensure that you've got ESU coverage in place. There's a variety of different flavors of how you would go about that, from more of the key-based kind of traditional approach to Azure client-based or Azure agent-based licensing versions. Microsoft is trying to be a little bit more flexible about this time around, and they've offered both commercial or consumer and commercial options to be able to get ESU coverage. So just take a look at that, make sure you're covered there. Otherwise, come November, your security update coverage is going to end. And I think that wraps up. We don't have anything else, I think, on the ESU side. Oh, Windows 11 22H2 will also be ending in October. So make sure you've moved your Windows 11 branches up to 23H2 or later. On that note, Todd, I think we're ready to go through the bulletins and releases. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everybody. Let's go through what released yesterday, talking about the bulletins releases. As Chris mentioned, we didn't catch it in our infographic, but there was a Chrome update. Captured the information here with a link to it as far as additional information available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. As usual, 2 vulnerabilities. These were not 0 days. They were just normal vulnerability reports. There's the 10.200 and the 10.201 CVE numbers. So just be aware of that one as you go through your patch process this month or this patch Tuesday. Capture that one as well. Chrome update there. Another one came out from Adobe as far as Acrobat and Reader goes. I know most of us go through and update our Reader updates out there. 2 vulnerabilities reported in these. One that has to do with arbitrary code execution. Another one is a security bypass vulnerability. They're already up to Bulletin 85 this year already. So a lot of releases on the Adobe side, and a lot of these are around Creative Cloud as well. Just talking about Creative Cloud applications, I've included the 2 that we support that were released this month. There was a critical update for Adobe Premium Pro. It's only a single vulnerability, 54.242, that was released, but it is for both versions of Premiere Pro, the 24 and 25 versions. Make sure if you're using this in your Creative Cloud, make sure you get it updated. It was rated critical. An important one as well for Adobe After Effects, 3 vulnerabilities that were related to a memory leak, typically an information disclosure type of vulnerability, so it's not as critical. They did rate this one important for the month. Again, this is Adobe After Effects in the Creative Cloud suite that came out. There were a number of other Adobe updates. You can check their security advisory page. I just included these because we do provide patches for these for our products, but there were others as well. Getting into the Microsoft releases for the month, we did see, obviously, the Windows 11 update. They addressed 58 vulnerabilities. The one I have highlighted in here is the one Chris talked about earlier, the 55.234, related to the SMB vulnerability, which is publicly disclosed. So I did have it highlighted in here. I also quoted the various KB articles. I included the Hot Patch KB article this month in particular because there is a known issue for those of you that are using Microsoft's Hot Patch capability. There is an issue with the PowerShell Direct Connect functionality is failing on hot patch systems, obviously the 24H2 and the 2025 devices. Essentially, it's an issue around an incompatibility when you have different versions of patch on the two pieces that are involved in the connection, the guest and the host. And basically their workaround right now, as they said, to update, make sure you update via hot patching or other methods, both the guest and the host to the latest version. Make sure that's updated, and then this issue will be resolved. That's their workaround for now. Haven't heard what else you're going to do yet, but that's what they quoted in the KB article for right now. That's the only known issue they reported this month, and again, it's related to the hot patch side. On the Windows 10 side, as Chris mentioned, we're rapidly approaching the standard end of life of Windows 10. So we'll probably see kind of a rush of updates next month, as well as another additional service stack update as they prepare version 22H2, which is the last one for ESU support. This month, though, across the board in all the Windows 10 updates, they had 56 vulnerabilities. Again, that publicly disclosed CVE related to the SMB transfer is part of this. So again, you want to make sure that your Windows 10 updates are applying the latest ones here. Same thing, they do offer hot patching on Server 2022, which is the Windows 10 kernel, by the way. And that same PS Direct is an issue there. So if you are running into that issue, if you are performing hot patching on that older server, make sure both the guest and host are up to speed. We did see two critical updates for Office, both the on-prem or the older legacy version of Office. This is the 2016 suite, as well as the long-term service channel for Mac. I quoted the different products that were impacted this month there in the Office suite. 14 vulnerabilities, a couple different types around remote code execution, spoofing, and information disclosure. Again, there were 14 vulnerabilities that were addressed and rated critical. A couple of critical vulnerabilities in there that drove up the rating on these patches. So on the Office side, you want to make sure that you are updating your older versions, as well as on the click-to-run versions. Similar kind of set of vulnerabilities. One was dropped. There are 14 in the other one and 13 in this one, and that happened to be the spoofing vulnerability. That is not an issue, apparently, in the online or click-to-run versions of Office, your 365 apps typically, which consist of, obviously, Office or Microsoft 365 apps, Office 2019, the long-term service channel versions 2021 and 2024. So be aware of those. Make sure you get all those updates in place. Again, 13 vulnerabilities, a couple rated critical in there this month for the online versions of Office. Chris did mention the publicly disclosed vulnerability related to SQL Server. It is a 2024 vulnerability. That is correct. It is 2024-21907. Must have been one, obviously, that was not addressed last year, but they brought it up now. I've quoted the different versions. There's the GDR as well as the CU updates, depending upon what patching model you're using for SQL Server. So they did offer the updates on both of those this month on all the supported versions, both 2016, 2017, and 2022 versions of SQL Server. No reported issues around this one. Rated important. So you want to make sure you get this one covered, obviously. And finally, SharePoint Server. A number of vulnerabilities here, 3 of them around remote code execution and information disclosure. I have the 3 CVEs listed. None of these are known to be exploited or publicly disclosed. They did have a known issue regarding calendar overlay again, so take a look at that and make sure that you have that covered in case you run into that with the update of SharePoint Server. Chris did talk about all the patches that were released between the Patch Tuesdays. We run a summary for you here. We break it down into different categories. I have security updates that did include CVEs where the vendors reported those. We have security updates without CVEs. A lot of times these are updates where the vendors tell us that there are security fixes in there, but don't specifically call out any of the CVEs by number, or they haven't been assigned. A lot of times there are security vulnerabilities that are not assigned formal CVE designations. And then we have the usual non-security updates as well. Going through the Windows side, we did see an update for AutoCAD 2026 this month that addressed 3 vulnerabilities. And by the way, typically in the designations shown here, you can see kind of the dates when we released the patches. So this first one was obviously September 1st when that AutoCAD update came out. We did see the ongoing releases for Chrome. Typically, these are weekly releases as Google is cranking them out. We had it all the way going back to the 8.19 release. The latest one, obviously, I quoted in the previous slide today. But we did see these 3 throughout the month. These are cumulative updates, just like the latest one. If you apply it, if you have not applied these, would be addressed with that cumulative update that came out yesterday in Google Chrome. We saw an update in Docker for Windows, version 4.44. The usual Firefox browser updates. We saw the mainstream 142 update, a couple of ESR for the extended service ones as well, the 128 and the 140 versions. So if you're using those or keeping on that older channel, make sure you do update those particular versions. We saw a number of updates, 17 vulnerabilities addressed in Foxit PDF Reader consumer version, if you are using that. And there's also an enterprise version, obviously, and they really addressed 8 vulnerabilities this month. This was back on 8/19. We did see a TeamViewer update, 1 vulnerability there. And on the mail side from Mozilla, we did see the Thunderbird updates for 142 and the ESR version. And if you're a Wireshark user out there troubleshooting problems and using Wireshark, there was an update for version 4.49. On the Apple side, we saw a number of releases there. Going into these, Chris did mention the 0 days. These were released mid-month, particularly around this particular CVE 43300 that you might have read about in the news. Again, all the 3 major operating systems that they're supporting. We know that macOS Tahoe, is coming out here shortly. I think they're going to release next week is kind of what we heard. They're changing up their naming version on that, by the way. It will be macOS 26 in keeping with the 2026 release, which they're shifting to. So it's a shift away from the version numbers they were using here, 13, 14, and 15. So you want to be aware of that when you see this and suddenly you see macOS 26. Might be a bit of a surprise. Again, that's Tahoe is their code name for that particular release. We'll see it next week, maybe. On the third-party side, on top of the Apple operating systems, we see the same Chrome updates, of course, because you can run Chrome on top of macOS as well as iOS. We saw a Docker desktop upgrade for Mac as well, kind of in keeping with the one we saw for Windows. On the browser side, we do see the kind of equivalent Firefox and Firefox ESR updates. Typically, a similar list of vulnerabilities. Sometimes they're applicable on the Windows side and not applicable on the Mac OS side and vice versa. So there might be some discrepancies here, but we do include all the vulnerability information associated with all of our patches. We did see updates for Edge throughout the month. Again, these are typically weekly as well, in keeping with the Chrome updates, because it is based on the Chromium engine. So you'll see a lot of similar vulnerabilities addressed in these. Again, 4 releases throughout the month corresponding to the 4 different weeks. And finally, we did see some Thunderbird updates for those of you running that email program on your Mac OS devices, Thunderbird 142 and the ESR versions as well. So quite a bit of activity throughout the month. We did see a couple of 0 days, as Chris mentioned, as well as the usual third-party application updates. So that kind of is a summary of what happened throughout the month. With that, Chris, let's take a look at what questions have been coming in.